Voiceover begins with a dramatic tone. Have you ever wondered what happens when power abuses the powerless? Imagine an elderly black man, unjustly arrested, silenced by those who should protect him. This is no ordinary story, it's a reckoning. In a place like this, the officer sneered as he stepped out of the squad car, eyes scanning Luther Grant like he was a stain on the sidewalk. They didn't check his name, they didn't care. To them, he was just another nobody loitering outside a high-end restaurant. They threw him in the back of a squad car, mocked him in the holding cell, and laughed when he warned them they were making a mistake. They saw an old man who should be afraid, a black man whose words didn't matter. But they didn't know they had just arrested Luther Grant, a retired Supreme Court justice. And when he made his phone call, it wouldn't be to a lawyer, it wouldn't be to a friend, it would be to the Chief Justice of the United States. By the time they realized who he was, it would be far too late, because this time, the black man they tried to silence would be the one who wrote the laws they had broken. Pause for effect. Are you ready for the twist that will shake this story to its core? Stay tuned. The city hummed with the quiet arrogance of wealth, a world built on glass towers and polished sidewalks. The Hamilton stood at the heart of it all, a restaurant of whispered reservations and exclusive clientele, the kind of place where the doormen held their posts like sentinels guarding the threshold between privilege and those who did not belong. Luther Grant stood just outside its entrance, wrapped in the quiet patience of a man who had seen too much to be in a hurry. He had arrived a few minutes early, as was his habit, preferring to collect his thoughts rather than rush through time as younger men did. His granddaughter, Claire, was inside finishing up an event with some colleagues from Georgetown Law, a dinner he had politely declined, allowing her the space to navigate the circles of ambition on her own. He had told her to take her time, he would be right here when she was ready. He glanced at the street, at the passing taxis and the slow-moving luxury cars pulling up to the valet. It had been years since he had allowed himself the leisure of standing unnoticed, of blending into the city without whispers of recognition trailing behind him. Even now, he felt the occasional glance, the fleeting curiosity in the eyes of pedestrians who perhaps thought they had seen his face before, though they could not place it. He preferred it this way. Anonymity had always been a luxury of its own. Across the street, a squad car idled near the curb, its engine a low growl against the quiet murmur of the night. The two officers inside had been watching him for several minutes now, their conversation tapering off as they traded glances, their easy laughter giving way to something colder, something unspoken but understood between men who had drawn their conclusions long before facts entered the equation. Officer Jake Roar tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the elderly black man standing alone outside the high-end restaurant. "Look at this guy," he muttered, shaking his head with an amused smirk. "They always find their way into places they don't belong." Brent Concade, the older of the two, exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening as he watched Luther adjust his coat with practiced elegance. "I swear they're getting bolder every year," he muttered. "Bet you anything he's waiting to hit someone up for cash, probably tailing one of these rich folks when they leave." Roar chuckled under his breath, pushing open the door as he stepped out. "Guess we better make sure he doesn't get too comfortable." Concade followed, adjusting his belt as they crossed the street with the slow, deliberate stride of men who expected compliance before they had even spoken. Luther did not turn when he heard the footsteps approaching, nor did he startle when the voice came, thick with authority and unearned confidence. "Sir, we're going to need you to move along." He inhaled evenly, allowing the moment to settle before shifting his gaze toward the two officers standing before him. Roar had a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth, his stance just slightly too casual, the posture of a man who enjoyed moments like these. Concade stood with his hands on his belt, fingers idly brushing the grip of his baton, his expression one of quiet amusement as though he had already decided how this interaction would end. Luther studied them both for a long, silent moment before speaking, his voice smooth and measured, unshaken by the weight of their stares. "I'm waiting for my granddaughter," he said simply. Roar's smirk widened, his head tilting slightly as he let out a quiet scoff. He said, dragging the syllables out like a man humoring a child's excuse, "See, that's the thing, you've been standing here for a while now, and we've had a few complaints about suspicious activity. Can't have people loitering outside a nice place like this." Luther held his gaze, unblinking. "Suspicious activity," he repeated, his tone devoid of curiosity because he had no need to ask what they meant. Concade exhaled, shaking his head as if the whole thing was some minor inconvenience. "Just move along, all right? We won't ask twice." Luther did not move, nor did his expression change. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat, slow and deliberate, his movements precise as he retrieved his wallet and held it out. "I assume you'll want to see some identification then," he said, his voice steady. There was a flicker of hesitation, a brief moment where Concade's jaw tightened just slightly. A sliver of irritation crossed Roar's face at the audacity of the man before him. He glanced at Roar, whose smirk had faded, replaced by something harder, something less amused. Then, without warning, Roar reached out and slapped the wallet from Luther's hand. It hit the pavement with a dull sound, landing just beside the curb, a scattering of crisp bills and neatly stacked cards spilling out onto the concrete. Luther did not flinch. For the first time, his expression shifted, not to anger, not to fear, but to something far more unsettling in its stillness, a patience so practiced, so deeply ingrained, that it became something more than silence. Concade stepped forward, his boot coming down firmly onto the wallet, pressing it into the cold pavement. "Didn't ask for ID," he muttered, his voice just barely above a sneer. Roar let out a short, humorless chuckle. "You got a problem with following directions, old man?" Luther's hands remained at his sides, his shoulders squared, his posture unyielding. He did not look at the wallet crushed beneath Concade's boot, he did not look at Roar's smug expression. Instead, he let the moment stretch between them, let the weight of their actions settle in the air. And then, with quiet certainty, he spoke. "You are making a mistake." Concade exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he leaned in just slightly, his voice dropping low. "Yeah," he murmured, "and what exactly do you think is going to happen here, huh?" Luther's eyes did not waver. "You're going to find out," he said. And in that moment, the air shifted just slightly, something neither officer could quite name, a threat of something unspoken but tangible, a quiet warning that neither of them had the sense to heed because they had already decided how this would end, and they were about to realize just how wrong they were. Pause for effect. Can you guess who will come to Luther's rescue? The stakes are about to skyrocket, keep watching Dark Threads. Luther remained standing exactly where he was, his posture as composed as ever, his eyes unwavering as they met Concade's sneering gaze. The weight of the moment settled between them like a stone, thick with the kind of tension that only ignorance and arrogance could create. The officers were waiting for him to break, waiting for the first sign of defiance, the first flicker of anything they could twist into justification. But Luther had spent a lifetime studying men like these, men who mistook power for righteousness, who mistook authority for wisdom. He would not give them what they wanted. Concade pressed his boot harder against the wallet, grinding it slightly into the pavement, his lips curling at the edges as though daring Luther to protest. "You're not hearing us, old man," he said, his voice laced with the easy confidence of someone who had never once faced consequences. "You've got about 3 seconds to start walking before we make you." Luther did not move. "I have told you already," he said, his voice even and deliberate, the kind of voice that had once filled courtrooms, that had delivered judgments shaping the very fabric of this country. "I am waiting for my granddaughter. I am standing on a public sidewalk. You have no legal grounds to remove me." Roar let out a sharp laugh, stepping close enough that Luther could smell the faint traces of cheap cologne and coffee on his breath. "Oh, we don't," he said, his grin widening, his fingers twitching slightly at his belt. "See, I don't think you understand how this works. You don't get to tell us what we can and can't do." Concade nudged the wallet aside with the edge of his boot, watching as one of Luther's credit cards slid out onto the pavement. "That's funny," he muttered, "guy like you standing around a place like this, all alone at this hour. Bet if I ran that card, we'd find out it's stolen." The accusation sat between them, deliberate, absurd in its audacity, and yet delivered with such practiced ease that it was clear neither of them expected to be challenged. Luther let out a slow breath, steadying himself, though not from anger. Anger was a luxury he had long since learned to set aside. No, what filled him now was something cold, older, something tempered by decades of knowing precisely how moments like these unfolded. "I suggest you rethink what you are about to do," he said, his voice quiet but carrying all the weight of certainty. Concade's smile faltered for just a second, barely perceptible, but Roar stepped forward, filling the silence with something uglier. "Yeah," he sneered, reaching out and gripping Luther's arm with a sudden, forceful yank, "you suggesting we need a damn permission slip to do our jobs?" Luther did not resist, even as Concade stepped in, his hands pressing against Luther's back with unnecessary force. Even as he felt the grip tightening around his wrist, Because you could act without thinking, you were protected from the consequences of your own ignorance. He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. You thought wrong. Roar's hands curled into fists, his pride still reaching for something that no longer existed. But Harrington wasn't finished. You think this ends with a suspension? Harrington's tone was almost amused, but there was nothing humorous in his expression. His head tilted slightly, his voice now sharper, colder. Final, your names are being forwarded to Internal Affairs, your files will be reviewed by the DOJ, every complaint against you, every excessive force report, every misconduct allegation that was quietly pushed aside, it will all come to light. Concade inhaled sharply, his entire body stiffening. Your careers are over. Harrington's voice did not rise, did not carry theatrics, it was simply a fact. Your pension's in question, your certifications revoked, your future's ruined. He took another slow step forward, watching as Roar and Concade shrank beneath the weight of his words. And the best part, there isn't a damn thing either of you can do about it. The words settled into the air like a slow-moving wrecking ball, crushing them completely. Roar's breath stuttered, his chest rising and falling too quickly now, his mind scrambling for something, anything, that could reverse what was happening, but there was nothing left to say, because they had already lost. Captain Sloan, who had remained visibly shaking at the edge of the confrontation, finally cleared his throat, his fingers still twitching slightly, his eyes dark with realization, with fear, with the full crushing weight of what he knew was still to come. This department, he stopped, his voice unsteady, as though each word carried an unbearable weight. He inhaled sharply, then tried again. What happens next? Harrington turned his head toward him, his expression unchanging. An investigation. The single word sent a shudder through the room. Sloane's hands twitched, his eyes darted toward the entrance of the precinct, toward his office, toward the walls that were now closing in on him. We can cooperate, he stammered, his words uneven, his desperation leaking through. We provide full transparency. Harrington let out a short, humorless exhale, something that was not quite a laugh. You don't have a choice. Sloane swallowed. Luther stepped forward then, his voice calm, smooth, but undeniable. This isn't just about them, he said quietly, his eyes still locked onto Sloane. The corruption in this department does not begin and end with two officers. He took another step closer, and Sloane did not move. This precinct is about to become a case study for systemic failure. Sloane's breath hitched. This is bigger than just Roar and Concade, Harrington continued, his voice as sharp as steel. This department will be investigated from top to bottom, and if I were you, Captain, I would start preparing for the moment when your name is on the chopping block. Sloane visibly swallowed, his entire body taut, his face ashen, because he knew his time was running out. Harrington straightened, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves, his tone returning to the sharp, controlled precision of a man who had already won. For now, these two are gone, he motioned toward Roar and Concade, who were still standing frozen in place, their worlds crumbling beneath them. Captain, I suggest you prepare for what's coming next. Sloane said nothing, he couldn't. Luther inhaled deeply, his gaze sweeping over the officers still standing, still watching, still waiting for what came next. And then, slowly, he exhaled, his voice smooth, steady, final. Let's go. Claire stepped forward, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides, but her expression was lighter now, her posture no longer tense. And together, they turned. They did not wait for an escort, they did not wait for permission, they simply walked. The doors opened before them, and as they stepped into the crisp night air, justice followed them. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the private conference room in the Supreme Court building, Washington, D.C., casting long, golden streaks across the polished wood of the table where Luther Grant sat, composed as ever. Across from him, Chief Justice Alan Whitmore was skimming through the file in front of him, his brow furrowed in concentration, the weight of the last 24 hours evident in the subtle tightness of his shoulders. Luther waited. He had spent decades understanding the way power moved, the way it shifted hands, the way it shaped itself around those who wielded it well. And right now, he knew Alan was processing everything, not just as a legal mind, not just as a government official, but as a man watching an institution buckle under the weight of its own corruption. Alan finally exhaled, shutting the file with a quiet thud, his fingers still resting on the cover, tracing the embossed DOJ seal. It's happening, he said simply. Luther nodded once, his expression unreadable. How fast? Alan leaned back slightly, adjusting his glasses, his tone clipped, precise. The 17th Precinct is being ripped apart at the seams. Federal oversight begins next week, but unofficially, it's already started. The officers involved are done. Roar and Concade's careers are over. Internal Affairs has uncovered at least 7 others with disciplinary records that should have gotten them dismissed years ago. Some of them are resigning quietly, trying to escape the fallout before it reaches them. Luther exhaled slowly, nodding once. And Sloan? Alan's lips pressed into a thin line. Resignation letter is already drafted. He's negotiating the terms of his exit, but it's only a matter of time. The governor wants to distance himself before this turns into a full-blown public scandal. He tilted his head slightly. He'll be gone before the end of the week. Luther didn't smile, but the satisfaction in his eyes was unmistakable. Alan watched him for a moment before shaking his head slightly, his own expression unreadable. This isn't stopping with one precinct, Luther. Luther leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table, his voice smooth, steady, but carrying an unmistakable weight. It never was. Alan let out a breath that was not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh. No, I suppose it wasn't. He tapped the file once, almost absent-mindedly. The DOJ is expanding the review to other precincts in the district. Once the first domino falls, the rest tend to follow. Luther nodded again, slowly, as though he had already known this, as though this had been the plan all along. Alan studied him for a long moment before leaning forward as well, his voice quieter now, but not uncertain. You realize what this means, don't you? Luther met his gaze without hesitation. I do. Alan exhaled through his nose. This isn't just a departmental shakeup. It's not just an investigation into a few bad officers. This is about to turn into something much, much bigger. He let the words settle before adding, and it's not going to be easy. Luther let the silence stretch between them for a long moment before he finally spoke, his voice calm, his certainty absolute. Nothing worth fighting forever is. Alan studied him again, his gaze flickering with something that almost resembled amusement before he smiled just slightly. Then let's make sure we finish what they started. Luther nodded once, slow, deliberate. And just like that, the fight truly began. The 17th Precinct did not feel the same. It had only been a few days since the night Luther Grant had been forced into a squad car, shoved into a holding cell, dismissed as nothing more than another black man who did not belong where he stood, but already the atmosphere inside these walls had shifted. The arrogance had faded, the easy confidence of unchecked power had been replaced with something colder, something sharper: fear. The investigation had arrived in full force. Federal auditors had taken over the precinct's main conference room, their presence looming over the station like an approaching storm. Internal Affairs investigators moved through the halls like vultures, combing through files, pulling officers aside for interviews that stretched for hours. Every desk, every filing cabinet, every digital record that had once gone unchecked was now being examined, dissected, cross-referenced. The officers who had once spoken with such casual authority moved differently now, their steps quieter, their backs less straight, their voices carrying none of the false confidence they had once wielded like a weapon. And in the center of it all, Luther Grant walked through those same halls, not as a prisoner, but as a reckoning. The air shifted as he moved. Some officers looked away as he passed, their gazes avoiding his as though afraid to meet the eyes of the man they had once laughed at, once dismissed, once thought they could break. Others watched him with unease, their expressions tight, their hands twitching toward their belts or their pockets, some unconscious instinct to hold on to the power they had spent their entire careers hiding behind. But they no longer held it. Today, Luther Grant held the power. Captain Richard Sloan was waiting for him in his office, his shoulders squared, his face set in something that tried to resemble composure, but Luther could see it, the slight tremor in his hands, the barely restrained tension in his posture. He had spent the past few days making pleas, excuses, calls to men who had once held influence, only to be met with silence. He had delayed the inevitable for as long as possible, but now there was nothing left to do except face what was coming. Luther stepped inside the office without hesitation, his presence unshaken, unmovable. Daniel Harrington had wanted to handle this meeting himself, but Luther had refused. This moment was his. The man who had turned a blind eye to injustice in his own department would answer to him personally. Sloane gestured toward the chair opposite his desk,